Good morning. My name is Greg Meyer. I'm the OSU Extension Educator in Warren County, Ohio, and welcome to the virtual Farm Science Review and the Utzinger Garden Talks. Um, my presentation this morning is going to be on small space and container vegetables. It is a pleasure for me to be here. Usually, of course, I'm live doing presentations from the gazebo itself, but we'll do the next best thing and do this virtual presentation on growing vegetables at home. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that you can see my presentation, and we'll go ahead and get started. As I said earlier, I'm the OSU Extension Educator in Warren County, which is in the southwestern corner of the state. A pretty suburban county, lots of agriculture still, but pretty suburban county, and get the opportunity to speak to many people about growing vegetables at home, particularly in situations when they don't have a lot of space to be able to do it. And growing food at home is something, whether it be the COVID or just the wanting to know where your food came from kind of a standpoint, has really grown in interest as I've gone along. So when I put on these presentations related to growing vegetables or even fruit at home, people have taken a big interest, and I usually get pretty big crowds of people to talk about it. Most of us don't have large backyards. We don't have very much space to be able to grow. In my county, we've got some soils that can hold on to some water and make it a little bit challenging to try and grow vegetables in your backyard. But there are options. There are things that you can do to grow vegetables in small spaces and in containers and still be able to feed your family. Some basics when we get started is just an understanding of what vegetables need in order to be successful. And it's not really rocket science. They need sunlight. They're a full sunlight plant. So they need 8 to 10 hours of sunlight per day. And that's based upon the fact that photosynthesis is required in large quantity to produce sugars for the energy of the plant. But when you also think about the fruit that they produce, like tomatoes or peppers, the biggest majority of how those fruit are made up is with basically sugar and water. So without sunlight, they don't grow as well. The fruit doesn't taste as good. So sunlight is absolutely an essential thing. Water, without question, as I said, that about 90% or more of the fruit that gets made is made up of water. So if we are low on water, then we don't get the proper fill of the fruit, and thus we don't quite get the productivity that we need. And the final thing that are needed are nutrients. Plants need food. It takes a lot of work to produce food for your table, and because of that fact that we've got to be able to provide fertilizer for plants as we go along. Now, where can they get them? Anywhere. Vegetables don't have to be in big gardens. They don't have to be in a traditional setting to be able to grow enough vegetables at home to save yourself some money on your grocery bill. And you truly can. Just a few tomato plants provides an awful lot of tomatoes. A cucumber plant provides plenty of cucumbers, and you can actually save yourself some money on your grocery bill. Provide fresh food for you to have on your own table, which is something that we're all looking for during these times. You can grow vegetables in small spaces. We can grow them in containers. I've been a container vegetable gardener myself for over 20 years. Started doing it when I had very little backyard. Would put out a tomato plant, a pepper plant. Basically, it's grown from there, where I do have raised beds at this stage of the game. So this is the way that I vegetable garden personally for my own family as we go through it. What's acceptable in terms of a space? Any place, any place that's got enough space for the plant and enough sunlight to provide those 8 to 10 hours of sun for what vegetables would be as a sun-loving plant. Those of you with limited landscapes available, we can intermingle vegetables within our landscaping plants, including like herbs, which can be very attractive. If you think a lot of why we put bedding plants and stuff out, we put them out because they're beautiful and they're colorful and they have flowers and all those kind of things from that end. Well, an eggplant is a green and purple plant. A tomato is a red and green plant. Um, so vegetables in themselves can be very attractive. Many herbs can be very attractive, and we can intermingle them with just some of our perennials and our annuals and be able to basically have an edible landscape. Window boxes is something that we could surely consider. As you can see the picture there full of flowers, but a lot of times we don't put our flowers in them until the middle of May, which waste an opportunity of sunlight and soil that we could potentially put lettuce or some other greens in that box for a little bit, get some food out of it, and then transition it over into flowers. Raised beds are a great option. As I said, I'm a big believer in raised beds, and I've gardened that way for many, many years. And also containers. I've done container gardening. All those fit well. If you got a back porch or a patio, or you live in a condo and you just have a small space, anybody realistically can find enough spaces out there that you could at least put a few plants out there that you could be able to eat from. So my objectives today are to discuss what types of vegetables work best in small spaces and containers, because some do work well and some not so much. We're going to talk about containers and raised beds, the how-tos, what kind of containers work, that kind of stuff. And then we're going to talk about some out-of-ground vegetable strategies in terms of fertilizing and watering and those kind of things to hopefully build upon my 20 years of experience, and some positive, some negative, so that you don't make the same mistakes that I've made as I've raised vegetables in this small space kind of a setting. So which ones work best? Well, ones that work best are ones that don't get too big. I mean, that's the basic end. And containers and patios type plants have gained in popularity. When you go to the nurseries and box stores, you can actually find them listed right on the label, basically patio tomato or container tomato at this stage of the game. But the ones that you're really looking for are ones that have a determined growth pattern. They're smaller, they're bush type plants. So when you look at a seed label or a seed packet, or you look at the stake that's in the plant as you buy it at the nurseries and garden centers, you're looking for something that's not going to get out of hand, because you simply just don't have enough space to be able to do it. Those that are indeterminate or vining type plants, like many of your tomatoes or your cucumbers, definitely things like pumpkins, stuff like that. It takes a little bit more space than what we're talking about with most raised beds or containers. So you want to kind of avoid those is kind of the direction that you'd want to go. You can see the picture of the gentleman there in his garden with his 9-foot tomato plants. Tomatoes aren't supposed to be 9 feet. That's an indicator that there was far too much nitrogen used. But clearly a plant that's going to be that big is not going to turn around and be acceptable in our small space kind of a situation as we go. So you're looking for bush type, determinate patio type that are going to stay relatively small and can stay in the location that you're trying to grow them. So which ones work? Surprisingly, there are some that a lot of times people don't think about. Broccoli can work, carrots clearly can work. Cucumber is one that they're actually beginning to develop some patio varieties of cucumber, determinate varieties of cucumber. I actually tried one out a few years ago. Excellent eating quality. Ran a little bit more than I'd probably hoped, to be honest with you. But if you've got a big enough container or a big enough raised bed, you can still do cucumbers in that way. Eggplant works great. Green beans, you can grow them up a fence. Green onions are easy in the uh, spring of the year. Your leaf lettuces and other greens are cool season type crops that you can start the season off with in April in a lot of cases, and actually end the season off with in October. Peppers, radish, tomatoes, the bush type, and herbs work fantastic in small spaces and containers, and you can be very, very successful and have a lot of fresh herbs. I've got a small herb garden just in a small corner of my spot in a small space, and get lots of fresh herbs to be able to use in the cooking that we do all summer long. So lots of different options of vegetables that you could potentially use. So as we start thinking about a container, and as we start thinking about a container and what containers are going to work well, basically anything, anything that will hold water um, could potentially turn into something that you could grow vegetables in. Clay, pots, plastic, metal, wooden boxes, any of those kind of things can work extremely well. You can see your picture on the top of the 5-gallon buckets. Um, Work excellent. They're perfect size for tomatoes and peppers. And the advantage of them, particularly if you're going to not keep your soil, is that when you get done with them, you stack them back up and you put them in the corner of your garage, and they don't take very much space. And next year, when it's time to garden, you just pull them back out. And if you're worried that they're all too plain, you could paint them and make them prettier and those kind of things as well. So like a 5-gallon bucket or even a 3-gallon bucket can work extremely well and not be too over challenging or expensive to get. Those containers can be porous, they can be non-porous, so it could be plastic compared to a non-glazed pot. Um, the biggest key to a good container is that it's got to be able to drain the water off. So those buckets that you see on the top shouldn't remain good buckets once you get done with them for vegetables, because realistically you need to drill some holes in the bottom of them so excess water has an opportunity to drain out. But use your imagination. I've seen people put them in boots. I've seen people put them in wash tubs or even toilets. Anything that use your imagination, because a container can be just a little bit of anything and can fit as an interesting part of a landscape decoration idea in some cases. When we start thinking about building raised beds, and I've built a lot of raised beds in my life, and rebuilt a lot of raised beds in my life, and mainly based upon the type of material that I've used, maybe did or didn't work very well or for a very long period of time. Generally, we would not recommend that you use treated lumber for food crops, particularly the old type treated lumber or railroad ties or those kind of things, because the material that they've used in them to prevent them from decaying can also leach. So just as a general recommendation, we wouldn't recommend them for food crop. Flowers, not as big a deal, but food crop, we probably wouldn't. You can use untreated lumber. Cedar's tremendously good. It lasts a really long time. It's expensive, but it will last a long time. You could use untreated lumber and just know that you're going to have to change it over as it begins to rot and decay a little bit, and maybe get away with a cheaper option that you just know you're going to have to change once in a while. Concrete blocks can work fine. You just put them out there and put soil behind them, and they can be really good. And if you put concrete blocks out there and put a board or something on top of it, then you've got a little seat to be able to sit down when you do it. Landscape pavers, if you're thinking to be a little more attractive. We're even starting to see the galvanized steel type products that are the ready-mades that you can just basically build and put them in the ground, and they're ready to go. The thing I warn about galvanized steel a little bit is that they can get a little hot, which means that they can pull moisture and water out of the bed. So not that you can't use them, but you may have to water some of those beds sometimes a little bit more, just based upon the reflection and the heat that may come off of them. Now, if you're going to use wood, the weak spot on a wood raised bed is the corner. And there actually are some manufactured metal corners that are available out there. And if you went out on the web and just Googled raised bed corners, you'll find about 3 or 4 of them will immediately pop up that you could order. And they're not all that expensive. And basically, you put the wood on them, and you screw the corner onto them, and it holds that corner from being able to separate. So there are some options there, or you could do a homemade one as well. When you're designing your raised bed, you want to be careful about how wide you make it, and this can be from personal experience. If you're going to do tomatoes, for instance, you need about a 24 inch width approximately. So that's 2 feet. If you get to a foot, might not be quite enough growing space. But in the same way, if you get too wide, then it makes it really difficult to manage the middle of the bed, because the value of a raised bed is that the soil in it is tremendously good and doesn't have a lot of compaction. And if you end up having to step in it and walk in the bed itself, you'll compact that soil, which can reduce some of your productivity. So my goal when I build that raised bed is that I don't want it to be so wide that I can't reach the middle of it from the outside. So for me, that's about a 4 foot maximum is what I've got. And if you did it at 4 feet maximum, and I said that tomatoes need about 2 feet of space, that means realistically you could be doing 2 rows of tomatoes or peppers in a raised bed and still have space for the plant and still be able to get in and manage and do the things that you need to do. The other thing I'd point out is that you can actually make raised beds too deep. It makes water management a little bit difficult if they're 2 feet deep, because it's really challenging to try and keep the surface where the plant is growing full of moisture, because all the water wants to feed to the bottom of the bed. So too deep can be a little bit of an issue from a water management standpoint. Generally 8 to 12 inches is an acceptable depth for most vegetables that you're trying to grow, maybe not potatoes, and maybe you need more depth for those, but for the most part, 8 to 12 inches is probably deep enough with soil for most of the vegetables that you're going to need. I realize some of us like to raise bed and garden because we can increase makes it easier for us to garden. We can raise them up a little higher. I've seen raised beds where it's kind of table height, where it's only about a foot deep, but it's kind of in a table, so you can garden while you're standing up, and that can be done. The biggest issue with raising them way up like that is that they will lose moisture relatively quickly. So you're probably going to have to water more when you raise the bed up and you have air moving on all the different sides. But lots of different options that you can use to go ahead and make a raised bed. Now, when I've done my raised beds or my containers, you think, okay, what should I fill them up with? A good growing media provides water, it provides nutrient, and it also needs to provide some physical support while still being well drained. Physical support meaning that that it needs to be able to hold a big, heavy tomato plant up and not have it basically come pulling out of the ground. So, you've got to think about that a little bit in terms of being able to support the crops that you're growing. You can do mixes that are soilless and just purchase them in a bag. There are some mixes out there commercially that the soil is actually included. I'd be honest with you, just based upon I do a lot of tomatoes in containers, have done it before, and having a little bit of weight in the container to try and keep it locked, held in place a little bit is important. But that weight needs to be quality weight. It needs to be have nutrients. It needs to provide support. So I personally like a little soil in my mix to give it a little bit of weight to kind of hold that pot where it's supposed to be. There's a lot of commercial mixes available, but you can also make your own. If you're only going to do a small raised bed or a few containers, by all means, you can mix up your own mix or just go buy it. OSU had a simple mix that they put together that basically was 1 part potting soil and sterile, meaning don't go dig it out of your garden and bring all the weeds and everything with it, but sterile potting soil to reduce the chances of diseases and weeds. 1 part compost. And the thing I'd say about compost is that good compost is something that you can't recognize what it used to be. So it doesn't really matter whether it's mushroom compost or leaf compost. You're looking at compost as organic matter to try and provide good drainage, and where it necessarily came from or how much it cost isn't the biggest deal as much as that we're trying to add some organic matter. OSU also would recommend adding some peat moss to it, which you could buy a bale and mix some of that up. Again, goes with the, that drainage issue that we're talking about. And then maybe a little bit of perlite, which can aid in retention of nutrients and other issues that we have sometimes with containers. And then when you fill that container, I'm also a big believer in putting in a slow release granular type fertilizer that will slowly over the life of the bed or the container for the growing season will continue to release some fertilizer as you go along, because fertilizer is a big deal when it comes to containers and pots, and we'll explain that in just a little bit. How much space does a vegetable need? Radishes don't need very much space, about 1 inch. Carrots, you can 3 inches on carrots, and green onions. The thing I'd point out to you on both of those with those little seeds is a lot of times we seed those significantly too heavy, and we actually need to thin them out so that they can grow appropriately. Doesn't take much space for snap beans, and if you had an area where you had a fence and wanted to grow some beans or something that climbed up that fence, you can do it and still get some food crop. Leaf lettuce, again, another one that you need to remember that you got to separate if you plant them too tightly, but about 6 inches on leaf lettuce, 18 inches on broccoli and peppers, and 24 inches on eggplant, tomatoes. All of these things that you see here, they don't take a lot of space, and in the grand scheme of things, for not very much space, they can provide quite a bit of produce. When you don't have much space, you don't want to waste that space on something that will only provide you a small quantity of food to eat. It would be silly to plant 3 corn stalks to get 3 pieces of sweet corn in the same spot that you could plant 1 tomato and get a half a bushel of tomatoes off of that would last you all summer long. You can go buy 3 years of corn and go ahead and take the free tomatoes from that standpoint. So make sure the things that you use make some logical sense as you decide what you're going to plant in your vegetable garden. Now, some tips for containers and raised beds. The first thing I got to say again is location, location, location. You've got to find a sunny location. Vegetables need at least 8 hours of full sun per day. And if you can't find them that much sunlight, then your productivity is not going to be near as good. Now, you say, I just don't have a place like that. I've got a place that I get morning sun, and I've got a place that I get afternoon sun. Well, if you're home and you're retired and you can do it, I mean, technically you could put a raised bed in a wagon, and in the morning have it in one location, and in the afternoon shift it to the other side and still get your 8 hours. Because that can be one of the advantages of a container, is that they can be mobile. And that can work to your advantage from the standpoint of you could potentially start your vegetables a little bit earlier, and if you happen to be getting frost or a freeze that was going to come, that you could move them into the garage or move them into the house or basement and keep them from getting frozen off. Put them back outside the next day, and not lose any time trying to get vegetables by the 4th of July, say. And it's tough to get vegetables by the 4th of July if you don't cheat when you get them started. If you plant tomatoes on Mother's Day, you're probably not going to get tomatoes by Mother's Day. But if you can use the advantages of the containers and bump your time up a little bit, you might actually get produce a little quicker in the season. And in some ways, you might be able to extend the season a little bit too, just based upon the fact that I could move those containers. Now, I would pay attention on containers. You need to watch where you locate them. You don't want to put them on spots that have excess heat, like on top of a blacktop driveway. And you want to watch reflections. So if you put them too close to a white fence, or you put them too close to a white house where the sun comes down and bounces off the house and gets the backside of the plant, you can often burn some leaves up pretty good. And I can tell you that from experience that I did that one time with a white fence that I had in my backyard, and fried up some tomatoes plants pretty good just because of the heat that was coming off of them. So be careful where you locate them so that you don't get reflections, you don't get any excess heat that's going to cause you issues. And the other thing with containers in particular is you got to not locate them in spots where the wind's going to blow a bunch, or else you're going to end up toppling those plants in a lot of cases. One other tip I'd say from doing containers in raised beds is I'm a believer in put the stakes in or the cages in right at the beginning, either before you plant or as soon as you plant them. Put the cage on top or put the stakes on top of them, and that way you don't have to worry about damaging the plant later on when you figure out that it's going to get so big that I'm going to have to do it. And even in a container, you're still going to need some support for those tomato plants. Even the patio tomatoes still need a little bit of support. When I fill my containers up, I pretty much just put the cage right in it and put the soil with it, and then put the tomatoes in it right from the get-go when I do container tomatoes from that end of it. And you can see in this picture the way that they used concrete blocks to go ahead and make their beds from that end of it, and it doesn't have to be fancy to be able to do it. Some tips in terms of planting your vegetable seeds or vegetable plants. If the package tells you not to cover the seed, then you just sprinkle it on the surface and tamp it down. General rule of thumb for planting seeds is twice as deep as the diameter of the seed. So if you had a really, really big seed like a bean or a squash that's about a ½ inch, you're only planting them 1 inch deep. Where this comes into play for most gardeners, even most experienced gardeners, is we do that finger trench where basically we're about 3 inches deep and we dump carrot seeds or radish seeds at the bottom of it. And realistically, you're way, way too deep when you're doing that. And because of that fact, your germination on a lot of those seeds just never really gets to the surface. So use that rule of only twice as deep as the diameter, which means that they're not going to be near as deep as most of us plant things. If you're putting transplants in the ground, you should put them in there at the same level that they were in the container, with an exception being tomatoes and broccoli, which you should plant deeper, particularly if they're spindly. If you go to the big box store and buy vegetables, you'll find that those plants that are on the bottom row tend to not get quite enough sunlight. They tend to stretch out a little bit and get a little bit light green in color. As long as they don't show symptoms of disease or insect, things like that, you can take a tomato plant like that home, plant it deep, give it some love, and a lot of times that tomato will be just as productive. By putting tomatoes a little deeper in the ground, every place that there's a node, they actually root up a little bit more, which in the long run can lead to a healthier plant. Now, the only time that you don't put tomatoes too deep, double deep, is if you did a grafted tomato, where you were where you had a root system that was there for protecting against diseases, and maybe an heirloom on top. You wouldn't plant those deep, because if the soil contacts the susceptible heirloom plant, then that disease is still going to get there, and you spend a lot of money on a grafted plant that you really didn't need to. Now, I'd say with regard to grafted plants, they're not really as needed in containers and raised beds as they would be maybe in the soil, because if I'm changing my soil out every few years in a raised bed or container, I'm not as concerned about those soil-borne disease getting started, which can be a really big advantage to you if all you want to grow is tomatoes and peppers. Then that's all you really need to grow. And if you ever get to the point where you have a disease problem that shows up, you just switch the soil out and clean the pot up, and you start all over again, which can be a great thing for those of you that only like a couple of vegetables. I would say this, with regard to containers, water is the #1 killer of plants, and that it can be too much or it can be too little. But the advantage of raised beds and containers that have good soil media to grow into is that and as long as you have holes in the bottom where they can drain out, it's just about impossible to overwater a container or a raised bed, because they'll drain out before they get too full. But with containers and raised beds, it's extremely easy to underwater them, because they're above the surface. They end up drying out and evaporating faster. So the thing you got to remember when I'm gardening above the ground is that I'm going to have to water more. I have a favorite saying that I do when I teach classes to people, which is that great gardeners don't have green thumbs. They have the uncanny ability to know when to water their plants. And I think that comes into play when you do containers and raised beds with vegetables or any plant. To be honest with you, it's knowing when to water your plant. The plant shouldn't be wilting when you decide to water it, because wilting is damaging plant tissue. You are trying to find the time when the plant needs it. Now, the great thing about containers and raised beds is that they are pretty darn easy to water, because the basic end is you should water them pretty much every day. And as long as there's good drainage, as long as there are holes in the bottom of them, you can't overwater them, which means that they're going to get provided with lots of water. And it's just a gardening chore that you would do with these each and every day as you work through it. Now, during the heat of the summer, actually, you probably may need to do it more often than not. I've got some pumpkins out actually in a larger raised bed that at this stage of the game, I'm having to water them multiple times during the day. I do it in the morning, I do it in the evening, based upon the fact that, one, pumpkins need lots of water, but two, the fact that bed dries out relatively quickly, and I need to make sure that those pumpkins can do what they want to do. It's the same thing with other plants. So you may need to adjust your watering practices to water more often, so that you continually keep that water full. Those of you with inventive minds could potentially set up an irrigation system in there with drip irrigation or on a timer or something like that, so that it just does it when it needs to do it. Picture on the left of a wilting plant means that there's not enough water to keep that plant turgid or firm. So when you see plants wilt, they need water. The picture on the other side of the tomato is blossom end rot, which is a calcium deficiency that's actually caused by bad watering practices. At some point in time in the process of that tomato, it didn't have water, so it didn't have enough nutrients, in this case calcium, to keep the cells from rupturing, and that's what happened. So the biggest tomatoes, the first ones of the season, sometimes that happens to, and you just need to make sure that you're watering more often so that that plant gets the nutrients it needs so that those cells don't fall apart and then they rot. So plan to water at least once a day, if not more in some cases during the heat of the summer. With regard to fertilizer, you're going to need to fertilize throughout the growing season just because of the fact that we water so much that you're going to leach all those nutrients out of the soil faster than you would in a traditional garden. As I said at the beginning, when you filled your raised bed or your container, you should put a slow release type fertilizer in there at the beginning, but you're still going to leach those nutrients out because of, when you water every day, that's a lot of water that's running through. When you under fertilize vegetables, they may mimic the appearance of a disease because they're going to get yellow, they're going to have stunted growth. Generally, they're just not going to be very healthy, and can look very much like a disease. I mean, I had a summer where I didn't water a couple of containers that were in an inconvenient spot as much as they would, and those things turned yellow. And I think the typical homeowner would have said, that's got to be a disease, and would have called me and asked me about it. Me as the extension person looked at it and said I did not do a good enough job of fertilizing these plants and watering these plants the way that they needed to when they're in a container. So you do have to, there's a little more maintenance to them in terms of water and fertilizer and those kind of things. So start with a slow release fertilizer, and then you're going to need to start supplemental fertilizer around the end of June, beginning of July, once those slow release fertilizers are kind of gone. How you decide to supplemental fertilize, you could go back to a slow release if you wanted to. A lot of people, though, like to go to the liquid type products, the Peters, the Miracle Grows, those kind of things, which is clearly something that you can do. But there are some strategies if you decide to use those liquid products. You should never fertilize a container or a bed when it is completely dry, because what will occur is that plant will immediately uptake the water and will immediately uptake large quantities of those nutrients. And during that time period, we can cause tissue damage. You can get, some nitrogen burning, those kind of things that can come from all those added salts from the fertilizer getting into that plant. You do not want that to occur. You don't want that plant to uptake that fertilizer that quickly. So what you realistically need to do is to fully water that container or that bed. Make sure that it soaks all the way through. It's coming out the bottom. How do you know in a container when the container is full of water? Well, it comes out of the bottom. When the water starts coming out of the bottom, then you know that it's completely full. Let it settle in a little bit, then come back and go ahead and fertilize using that liquid or soluble fertilizer that's there. You're going to do that weekly, or you're going to do that every other week, depending upon the label. Now, my personal recommendation would be is to read what the label is going to tell you, and actually use half of the rate that they would tell you. So if they tell you a quarter cup per gallon, for instance, which is a lot, but I'm just using it as a number, I prefer to go to quarter cup per half gallon, or quarter cup per 2 gallons, so to speak, because you want half of the rate in there. But because I'm going half rate, I'm actually going to fertilize twice as often. So let me repeat that. If they said if they say quarter cup per half gallon, you want to put it as a quarter cup per gallon to dilute the fertilizer a little bit more, So you're only going to use a half a rate, but what you're going to do is to fertilize twice as often. So if it gave you a rate and said do this every 2 weeks, well, you do a half rate and do it every week, because what you're trying to do when you use a strategy like that is to eliminate the great big spikes and the tremendous lows that you can go through when you use liquid fertilizers, because those nutrients get used up very, very quickly. They're already soluble. The plant can use them. The plant can take them right up. So right after you fertilize them, there's a huge spike of nutrients, and then 2 weeks later, there's basically nothing left. And during that time period when there's nothing left is when you can find things like blossom end rot and some other issues start to occur. So I want to reduce the huge hills and the low valleys. So I'm going to use half rates, but I'm going to do it twice as often, so that I can be more consistent with the amount of fertilizer that I have out there for those plants. Some other tips I would give you as we begin to close the conversation here. One is that you need to go check your plants daily for diseases and insects. Um, what you do about those is up to you. I'm not pro organic, anti-organic, anything like that, but you have to inspect your plants to know whether you have a problem that's getting started, and then once you do what you do about that problem, is up to you in terms of your management. It could be that I found tomato hornworm, and realistically I can pick those off. It could be that I found squash bug. I can potentially pick those off, or I could spray. Um, I might have some diseases that I have to make some decisions on about how devastating it's going to be to the rest of them, from that end standpoint. So how you proceed once you have a problem is a little bit up to your management style, but you need to inspect them so that you know that you have a problem, so that you can catch it before it gets too big. The other thing that I would say is that you need to harvest your vegetables. As stupid as that sounds, harvest your vegetables, because what a plant is realistically doing is the plant's not making vegetables for you because it wants to make your vegetables. It's making seeds so that life can continue, and the covering over the seeds is the fruits and vegetables that we eat. So what you need to do is to keep that plant from thinking that it's done its job, and provided all the seeds that's needed, and stop producing more flowers and fruit and stuff like that. So the more that you harvest mature fruit, the more you will encourage that plant to keep making more fruit. If you can't use everything that the plant has given you, because you've done a good job, then I'm sure there are people that would be willing to take some tomatoes or peppers or things from you, between your neighbors, your friends, your family, or a local food bank, that would be more than willing to take that. But make sure that you continue to harvest your vegetables when they are mature, so that we continue to encourage that plant to give us more food to eat throughout the growing season. So it concludes my talk for this morning on small spaces and container gardening. The thing I would encourage you is that anybody can vegetable garden at home. It doesn't really make a difference how much space that you have. You do have enough space to grow something that you can use at home. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now at this stage of the game, and say thank you for joining us at the Farm Science Review virtual programs and the Utzinger Garden horticultural programs. I've hoped you've learned some things today and that you can use those at home. Thank you, and have a good day.